everybody. Thanks for joining us on our webinar today. My name is Bridget Cabrera, and I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I'm the Executive Director of Methodist Federation for Social Action. We are really excited to be co-hosting this series of webinars with the United Methodist for Kairos Response, our wonderful coalition partner. We've been doing this for almost a year now, so these are we're really excited to continue our conversations together. MFSA is a national social justice organization that mobilizes justice-seeking people of faith to take action on issues of peace, poverty, and people's rights within the church, the nation, and the world. A few announcements for our conversation today. Please continue to keep your video off and audio on mute. This will help us with our connection. This will ensure that we are able to hear our speakers and see our speakers with this many people on our call today. The webinar will be recorded, so you will be able to view this, share this, watch this again in the coming week. It will be shared by both UMKR and MFSA. We ask that you use the chat for the rest of this webinar exclusively for questions for our speakers. So once we start, I know folks are introducing yourselves. Once we start, if we can reserve that just for questions. And we're also offering closed caption. Please excuse any sort of misspellings or mistakes in the closed caption. They are being automatically generated. So now we'll turn over our conversation to our moderator, John.
Hi, everybody. My name is John Wagner. Along with Lisa Bender, I'm co-chair of United Methodist for Kairos Response. We're a United Methodist organization, not official, but part of the United Methodist Church, we believe. We've been going for about 10 years now, and our advocacy includes divestment and boycott, also talking about authentic travel and various other issues we're trying to deal with right now as we move on. So I'd like to introduce our speakers today, and they are Reverend Kelvin Sauls, who was born in South Africa, was part of the anti-apartheid movement there as a teen. He was part of his Methodist Youth Fellowship there. He's been a United Methodist pastor. He has been involved with just a number of causes. He is currently the network strategist for community health councils in Los Angeles and a senior fellow with the Atlantic Institute for Racial Equity, I'm sorry. He's been a long time part of our effort in United Methodist for Kairos Response, and even before we started. So we're very grateful to have Kelvin here. I'm going to go ahead and introduce Sandra also. She'll be following Kelvin. Sandra is Palestinian, longtime advocate for Palestinian rights. In 2012, she was barred from entering Palestine because of her activism, has not been able to go back there since. She is currently executive director of the Adala Justice Project, a Palestinian advocacy organization. She's been very involved with racial justice, Black liberation movements, got involved in St. Louis after the killing of Mike Brown, and she has at one point was the co-chair of the steering committee for the U.S. campaign for Palestinian rights. So we're grateful to have both of these fine people with us. I'm going to start with Kelvin and ask him to share, and then afterward we'll hear from Sandra. We'll also hear just a brief word from David Wildman, one of our United Methodists, and I'll introduce him later. I'm going to ask that you please stay on till the end of the webinar because we have a special request from Rabbi Alyssa Wise from the Jewish Voice for Peace. And she has something specifically for this audience of United Methodist, a special request for to be a part of a campaign of particular note just now. So Kelvin, will you please start?
Thanks so much, John. Good day, everybody. Good to be with you today. And let me just say that my pronouns are we and us. And I also wanted to just celebrate all of our women because, Monday was International Women's Day, as well as this is Women's History Month. And I particularly want to lift up, our women all over the world, but specifically, those who are in South Africa, as well as in Palestine. So just wanted to go ahead and just, celebrate that and just mention that. I will share a couple of stories and also, some definitions for us for our conversation, and certainly looking forward to what I believe is a relevant and intersectional, conversation that is very, very timely, for us, right now. As I mentioned, I was born and raised in South Africa, born and raised on the south side of Johannesburg in a township called Kliptown. And so it's, not probably ironic that I find myself, doing my transnational work now from the south side of Los Angeles. So that's the intersection that I live with on a daily basis as I deal with all of the drivers of disparity, that we have here in South Los Angeles. But I take back to the southern tip of Africa, the south side of Johannesburg, and I share with you that, when I was in the 6th grade, my childhood, on the south side of Johannesburg was disrupted when one of the pillars of the apartheid regime, entitled the Group Areas Act, this policy reached our community of Kliptown. This segregation policy forcefully moved people into racially designated communities. Discrimination and division disrupted my family of 9. This experience of displacement was both traumatic as well as transformative. Trauma rooted in white supremacy and anti-Blackness removed my innocence and awakened my conscience. This experience of forceful displacement shaped my life's mission. And let me, just ground or frame this experience for you in a broader context, of what apartheid is. After all, this is what is the point of departure that we are using for our conversation today. Let me share with you my definition, of apartheid. Apartheid, is an ideology and a theology of white supremacy. It is a political, economic, and cultural system of continued colonization by one racial group of persons over another racial group of persons, with the intent of establishing a society governed by white religious nationalism and racial capitalism. That's the framework or definition that I have come to know and understand about apartheid as I continue to reflect on it and as I continue to recover from what I called the apartheid, or post-apartheid, syndrome. And so that framework, has really guided me, as I've lived my life. And throughout my life in South Africa, and as well as in the United States. And so I'm glad that I am a Methodist, part of a Methodist tradition, in South Africa, later on here in the United States, that clearly, is concerned not just about the soul of people, but is concerned, of course, about their social, their political, experiences. And it has enabled me to begin to realize how we can facilitate freedom and liberation for all. I thought that this was just an experience that was going on in South Africa. After all, the apartheid regime did an excellent job of isolating, just like any abuser, isolating us from, what was going on in the rest of Africa and in the rest of the world. And so, consequently, they would, of course, show us images of all the worst parts of Africa and elsewhere, and try to make us believe that we had it good in South Africa. Well, that certainly did not last, long for many of us, because we began to be conscientized as to what, was going on. So as I was connecting with my friends, in East Tennessee, both, friends from El Salvador, friends, from several other, South American countries and other African countries, I was just amazed that my isolated, what I thought was my isolated experience was actually a global experience of what was going on. And so when I was in San Francisco, and I think my dear friend Ethan Flad is on here with the Fellowship of Reconciliation, we had the opportunity to review a movie called Rabbit in the Moon that I'll never forget. And that movie helped me to understand the global forces that contributed to what was going on in apartheid, because that movie talked about, what happened with our Japanese sisters and brothers in the United States in 1948. Of course, in 1948, when apartheid became the law of the land, something significant, of course, happened, well, because Israel then becomes a state. And so that really made it clear for me as I began to understand, the history of white supremacy in the United States and how there were some connections around that. But it really got crystallized for me when a couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to participate in one of those authentic tours that John mentioned, when I took a group of African-American pastors to South Africa, for a conference, and we ended up in Durban. And while we were there, we had a great time, and, I was their host. And one day they had a free day and they could do whatever they wanted to do. And so they said, well, you know what, we want to go and check out the Jewish Holocaust Museum in Durban, South Africa. I said, oh, that's great. You guys go ahead and have a great time. So they're like, man, you are host. You got to come with us. And, reluctantly, I went with them, seeing that I was the host. But that was very, very transformative experience for me, because in that museum, what was so powerfully and painfully showed was the narrative of how the fall of Nazism contributed to the rise of apartheid. The fall of Nazism contributed to the rise of apartheid. And that was, for me, a very, very powerful experience. Again, as now this 6th grade experience that I've had is now beginning to become a global lens of what was happening, all around the world. And it all culminated in 2008, when while on staff at our mission agency, the General Board of Global Ministries, where I met my dear friend and brother, David Wildman, and began to be very involved around what was happening with our citizen brothers in Palestine. I then went on that particular trip. And my experience in Israel, Palestine was an experience that connected me back to that 6th grade experience of trauma, of displacement, as I experienced what was happening, in Hebron, what was happening in all of Palestine, the discrimination even around who could travel on which roads. But it all came to a head when I decided to spend an evening with a family, a Palestinian family, in the village of Wadi Fakin. And I shall never forget that experience, my conversation, my meal, and my evening there. Because it was a very, very traumatic evening, because there were Jewish settlements that were constructed, of course, above this village. And I could not sleep that night because of the bright lights and the noise that would go on all night long. And I would ask our hosts, does that stop at any time? And he said, no, it does not. That's what we face 365 days of the year. And we just have to deal with all of these oppressive strategies to engage in our ongoing forceful removal from the land of our ancestors. And then, the next day, as I went for a walk with them, I pointed to a particular area in that village, and I asked, so what's going on over there? It kind of looks, a little crazy over there. And they disclosed to me that that's the area where the community living in the settlements, that's where they would unleash their sewage into the village. And I just started crying as I again revisited this experience that I've had as a child in South Africa.
Kelvin, sorry.
Yes.
We're going to have a chance to explore that more. If it's okay with you, I'd like to move over to Sandra here. Is there anything you want to finish up about that one trip?
Yeah. And so the conversations there was just very, very powerful. And let me close by just saying, that it really invited me, as I do the work that I do now in racial equity, to really determine what my theory of change is, which I think is critical that I wanted to share. And then I'll, I hand over to my sister Sandra. My theory of change, that I concluded out of all of this that guides me now is that when some people mobilize to otherize, we all must organize to humanize. And the reason for that is because God is not a tribal God, but a God of justice. To paraphrase the Reverend Frank Chikani, I don't believe that our God supports the discrimination, disregard, and decimation of people on earth who are made in God's image. And I think that's very, very important for us to realize as we continue this work, of facilitating, an end to the occupation and colonization, of our Palestinian sisters.
Thank you, Kelvin. We'll get back to you in just a bit. First, we're going to hear from Sandra Tamari, and again, she's coming to us from St. Louis, where she's been a local activist as well as a national, international activist. Sandra.
Thank you, John, and thank you so much, Brother Kelvin, for your words and for your sharing your trauma of your childhood and the connections that you made in Palestine, and your theory of change, organized to humanize. All of that rings very true in my own work. Thanks for everyone for joining. I mean, apartheid, the connections between apartheid in South Africa and what is happening today in Palestine is a very powerful analogy. And these connections between South Africa and Palestine go back many decades. Third world liberation movements of the 50s, 60s, and 70s led to General Assembly recognition that apartheid is a crime against humanity. And now the ICC in 2002 adopted a definition of apartheid as inhumane acts committed in the context of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination of one racial group over another, with the intention of maintaining that regime. So this incorporation of a definition of apartheid inside international law, gives that framework universal applicability in all its manifestations. And as Brother Kelvin pointed out, apartheid is not, doesn't operate in isolation. Authoritarian regimes do talk to each other. They do share methods of oppression, and they are inspired by each other. And we don't have to go very far to think about what those inspirations are right here in our own country, as we sit on occupied land, unceded Native American land, as we know that this country's wealth was built upon the backs of stolen Black labor from Africa. We don't have to look very far to see where South African leaders under apartheid, found their inspiration. It's not far. And Israel is the same. If we wanted to just talk about Israeli apartheid today, it's very simple. Today, Israeli apartheid looks like this. We have a privileged Jewish Israeli population that has access to the COVID-19 vaccine and is returning to normal lives. Restaurants are open, coffee shops are open, while Palestinians under military occupation have little to no access of the same vaccine and are continuing to die of the virus. Hospitals are full. And just this morning, one of the health offices based in Ramallah at 3 a.m. was raided. So not only are they prevented from accessing the vaccine, which is required by Israel as an occupying power, their ability to even provide basic health services to their own population under such terrible circumstances is being destroyed. So the state of emergency we're in is not an anomaly, it's an illuminator, but we already know exist. I want to dig in on one particular aspect of apartheid in South Africa and Palestine as a way of showing how these systems are connected and how they work. We know that identity systems are very important, right? You otherize. How do you otherize? You have to give people an identity, and you have to enforce that identity upon them. In South Africa, that looked like the pass laws in the pass book, which I'm sure Brother Kelvin is very familiar with. The pass book was required. Every male over the age of 16 needed to have a pass book on their possession at all times. It determined where you could be It determined where you could work, where you could study. And more than 17 million people were jailed in South Africa over the course of the apartheid regime for failing to have updated passbooks. If you didn't have your passbook, right to jail, sometimes into forced labor camps. This looks very similar to the way that Israel identifies Palestinians into different categories of the demographics as a way of controlling mobility, controlling demographics, controlling where you live, controlling where you can study, and where you can work. And I just want to share with you a really illuminative infographic that lays this out well. Let's see if I can get to the right place. I hope that you're seeing my screen, which shows an infographic that's from Visualizing Palestine. And I will just briefly go through from the bottom up, the different stratas of Palestinian demographics. You have a whole class of the majority of Palestinians who are living in exile like myself, whether they be refugees or nationals of third countries, other countries. Palestinian exiles, 5.7 million of us, who are excluded from residency on the land, from being in the land. And myself, as John mentioned in my introduction, refused from even being able to visit my father's place of birth. My father is also caught up in this web because he wasn't on the population registry that was tabulated in 1967 when his hometown of Ramallah was occupied. He had immigrated to the US just before then, a few months before the occupation started. He wasn't in the census. So he doesn't have the right to live in his hometown, except at the discretion of Israel. He can enter as a tourist on his American passport. We go up, and then you have the Palestinians of Gaza, 1.6 million people, who are barred from living anywhere outside of Gaza, cannot enter the West Bank, cannot leave the territory except with Israel's permission. Obviously, we're all very familiar with the situation in the West Bank, where you have different areas, cantons, Bantustans, sometimes they've been referred to, where Palestinians are prohibited from movement through hundreds and hundreds of checkpoints, places of extreme violence and extreme danger, and unable to develop an economy because of the cut up nature of the land, and unable to cultivate their own farmlands. And then I think this is, we have Jerusalem. Jerusalem, they have a Jerusalem ID, but they can lose their Jerusalem residency at any moment if they somehow are not in the city. They don't have a physical presence in the city, or they don't see Jerusalem as their main source of their lives, of their cultural lives. And I think the most important thing here is that we have citizens of Israel, 1.3 million people who remained in 48, the parts of Palestine occupied in 1948, who are barred from living on 68% of the land. That's enforced through all kinds of things, including admissions committees that decide whether you are socially suitable to live in a community or not. They don't say no Palestinians allowed, but they do say things like you have to be a Zionist, or you have to have served in the Israeli military, which Palestinians do not do. And finally, then you have the strata of privilege. This system of Zionism is very similar to white supremacy in this country and in South Africa, where Jews have all the rights, can live anywhere, including in occupied West Bank. They do not have restrictions on their movement. So all this to say is that identity plays a very important part in how these systems work and control. I think another important part of the apartheid analogy is to understand that BDS, boycotts, divestments, and sanctions were an important part of how South African apartheid was taken down. And one of the early campaigns against South African apartheid was the campaign to get Polaroid cameras to divest from South Africa. There was a young Black woman who was a chemist that worked in Polaroid. She realized that Polaroid was the camera that's being used to create the photographs for the passbooks that were used inside South African apartheid to control Black movement. And she launched a campaign with other workers within Polaroid, and it took a long time. It took several years before Polaroid finally came around and was one of the first companies to divest from South Africa. Today, there are campaigns against Hewlett-Packard, which is the system that Israel uses for its ID system, for the checkpoints, for all the data that it keeps in the population registry. So let's hope that we have a moment like the Sharpeville massacre, which was in 1960, a direct action against these passbook laws, these pass laws. Perhaps, in a decade's time, we'll finally see people seeing, the Sharpeville massacre and the Gaza Great March of Return as, similar kinds of protest movements, direct action against these kinds of discriminatory, racist laws. I also think it's important for us when we use the South African analogy that we understand that no one would ever say, and I know maybe they did at the time, but no one would ever say apartheid was only a system that operated in the homelands or in the Bantustans. They understood that all of South Africa was an apartheid regime, right? It was a structure. And today what we have is many people who say that Israel is only a flawed democracy and it's the military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza that makes it an apartheid regime. That is really twisted logic in many ways, right? Because if we understand the way that Israel was founded, if we understand the elimination of the native population, which happened in the Nakba and continues today, how can we, excuse, right? It's discrimination by giving it a pass and giving it this liberal facade of democracy. Just because Palestinians who managed to stay on the land, have the right to vote, does not mean that Israel is a democracy. It means it's a colonial regime that's put on the facade of liberalism, right? So it's important for us to take that analogy as well. Israel is a apartheid regime from the river to the sea, as Beit Salem recently said, Beit Salem being the leading Israeli human rights organization, repeating what Palestinians have been saying for decades. But important to be reminded that Beit Salem did not say that there was racial discrimination in the land. The report does not mention race in any way. What it says instead, as a way of trying to cover up the nature of the regime, is saying that there are competing nationalisms. And I want us to resist that kind of, that analysis. If we understand Zionism as a settler colonial project, if we understood South African apartheid as a settler colonial project, then the only response must be an anti-colonial response. And that competing nationalisms gives the idea of two equal sides, right? With two equal claims to the land. And that's an erasure of Palestinian agency. So I think there's a lot for us to learn, but I think that how we define the problem decides how we search for solutions. So Palestinians are looking for a decolonized Palestine. They're looking for an end of Zionism. They're not looking for a civil rights movement or reform of a very unjust system. So I hope that we can build on that conversation and take a lot of inspiration from what the South African resistance movement has able to accomplish, and know that it's only the first step in a longer process.
Thank you so much, Sandra. I'm going to start our questions with this one. What is what are some of the real distinctions between South African and Israeli apartheid, and what are some of the false distinctions that are made by those who do not want to see this analogy applied? I'm going to start with you, Sandra, and then Kelvin, if you'd like to respond.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. I think that, I covered a few of these ideas that somehow we're not dealing with racial discrimination, rather it's a competing nationalism. I think that's one that people use a lot because they don't think of Palestinians as a race. It was much easier for people to understand racial discrimination in the case of South Africa because you had a white minority ruling a Black majority. What you have in Palestine is Palestinians are racialized, more of a definition that maybe the British have adopted in their internal politics rather than the US, not based on color, but based on the way they are treated, the way that they are categorized, the otherized part. The other part that's very different, obviously, between the two is that South Africa was very dependent on Black labor. And the exploitation of labor was very brutal and different than what it is in Palestine. What Zionism did is it made Palestinian labor unnecessary. It excluded Palestinian labor from all industry, from unions. It actually forced Palestinians to prop up, right, Israeli industry and Israeli economics. So that is a major difference, and I'm sure I can think of others, but I'll pass it on to Kelvin.
Go ahead, Kelvin.
Yeah, I think, in terms of just some similarities, let me just lift up a few. One would be, the way land was, distributed. I mean, several years ago, when you look at the map of the Bantustans that apartheid came up with, and how Israel divided the land, there was a stark comparison, a stark connection between that, and then of course later on South Africa introduced what was then called a trichemical parliament, that said that certain race groups can only vote for their for this paternalistic racial categorization that apartheid came up with, and Blacks basically had to go to the Bantustans to vote, and the other categories that were created, Indians as well as coloreds, they could vote only for those folk. But that was not a democracy, and that's why I think that's another key piece. I think that South Africa picked up, and connected with what was going on, in Israel. Sandra mentioned some distinctions. One of course would be, the numbers, with a majority Black, and a white minority. But that also shows us why this was, and that's why my definition of apartheid, and somebody put in the chat, that it really is how it's pronounced, apartheid. Keep people apart, teach them to hate each other based on their differences. Right? While that was going on, part of all of that was how then the cultural, political, and economic system that was put in place. And I think that's what's so critical for us to understand. It ain't just about this being a civil rights movement that we had in South Africa. It's not just about looking for the right to vote, right? It is about how do we, deal with, colonization as it appeared, culturally as well as economically. and we have yet to get to these last two, in South Africa right now.
Thank you, Kelvin. Here's another question that came up. What role did South African Jews play in the South African Anti-Apartheid campaign? And do those persons now view Israel as an apartheid regime? So I guess it goes back to you, Kelvin, for a brief answer to this. I know we discussed this earlier.
Yes, I mean, just like in the United States, the Jewish community, they were all over the place. In fact, as far as I'm concerned, they were trying to cover all their bases in terms of that. And so there were, one segment of the Jewish population, because they were a privileged group. I mean, Jews were whites in South Africa. So apartheid benefited everybody who was white because it was based on white supremacy. And Jews gladly accepted that privilege and used it as a pipeline, to see how they can build, economic, influence as well as economic power, and then there were, of course, some Jewish communities, a segment of the Jewish community that supported the liberation, movement, around that, and so they form part of, white, progressives and liberals, that were part of the Dutch Reformed Church, that were part of the interfaith, a movement against apartheid. They of course supported, the fight against, apartheid and for, liberation. I don't know, how Jews viewed, Israel, but one thing is clear, that year 1948 is a very, very significant year in terms of apartheid becoming the law of the land and Israel, so you have these two, countries that really, birth itself with this connection, of supremacy, white supremacy and white privilege, not just that, but also of religious nationalism. You have to never forget that, because, that is all part and parcel, of what was going on, around us. And so, just like in, in the United States, and everywhere, I believe, people try to cover both sides, I guess, just in case, transformation, liberation comes, around that. And so that was certainly true in South Africa as well.
Thank you, Kelvin. I guess I'd like to move over to Sandra at this time and just talk about Jewish Israelis and the kind of support that liberation movements have received from them, or the opposition from Jewish Israelis in that context. Could you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'm based in the U.S., so my experience inside the homeland is limited. Obviously, there have been anti-Zionist Israelis. There have been groups of people who have opposed the discrimination against Palestinians. Unfortunately, that number is shrinking. People are leaving the country. Leftist Israelis who have options are leaving. So that we're seeing, the right wing has continued to have a very strong foothold in electoral politics, in discourse, in society. So, I don't have a lot of hope currently from change coming from within. What we do see is a growing number of Jews living in other places, especially in the US, especially young people who are shifting their ideas about what it means to have an ethno-state that claims to represent you. Israel doesn't represent all Jews, but claims to represent all Jews. And really making the connections between authoritarianism and white supremacy here at home with what Israel is doing.
Could you say something about the kind of support that Palestine is receiving, or Israel and Palestine I guess both of them are receiving from other Arab states? That question has come up.
Yeah, it's an important question. I mean, I don't think that Palestinians have ever felt like the Arab nation, the Arab governments, let's say, have been on their side. Palestinian political stances are radical stances because they are anti-imperialist, they are generally anti-capitalist, and they are radical for the regimes of the region. So they may pay lip service to freeing Jerusalem. They may pay lip service to being in solidarity with Palestinian liberation, but their political affiliations, their political outlook is very authoritarian. So actually, the deals that we're seeing between Israel and the Gulf monarchies are very natural. You know, these kinds of these alliances have been present, but they now are out in the open. They're about shared, you know, interest, right? They're about shared economic interest, shared defense interest, shared securitization and control of their population. So, you know, this idea that, you know, Israel throws around as if it were a talking point. Israel's the only democracy in the Middle East. Well, that's a really low bar, unfortunately. So okay, take it, you know, whatever. But the people is a different story. You know, the people of the region continue to be aligned with the Palestinian people. You know, the Arab Spring is celebrating, you know, it's this 10th year anniversary, right? The start of the Arab Spring in Tunis in January of 2010. We are, you know, these are unfinished revolutions. They continue. When Bahrain signed the deal with Israel last year, the Bahraini people, under great political threat to themselves, you know, spoke out against the normalization deal. And the #1 trending, you know, hashtag on Twitter from Bahrain was "No to normalization," even though the regime is horrendous and will crack down on anyone who speaks out against the regime. They took those risks and stood with the Palestinian people. So, you know, we have unfinished revolutions in our region.
Thank you, Sandra. I'm going to just take a short break since you both mentioned the international community and how that impacted South Africa with the boycotts and divestments that were made at that time, and the current effort to fight nonviolently through financial and economic activity, boycott, divestments, and sanctions, we call it. I'm going to call on David Wildman, who is our Middle East area liaison and representative to the United Nations for the United Methodist Church. In just a few minutes, David, talk about the response of the United Methodist Church and some other denominations to this call for this kind of special assistance to the struggle for liberation of Palestine.
Thanks, John. And it's great to see everybody here, so many folks on the call. And a special thanks to my dear friends Kelvin and Sandra for sharing. I don't want to take too much time, but I just want to acknowledge, I think, like scripturally, removing the log in our own eye is something we as United Methodists have to take seriously. That racism has been something that's both divided us, and the struggle for racial justice has brought together Methodists throughout our history. So I just want to put that out there, that as we're struggling against apartheid, we have to look at that racism within, especially for those with white privilege, such as myself. So I want to say just a couple quick things. Is in 1968, when the United Methodist Church formed, one of the key study documents that we put out called for an end to all arms transfers to the Middle East. So in effect, we were calling for sanctions in 1968, 1 year after the Six-Day War and the occupation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, to say we can't solve the problem necessarily right now, but we should stop military sales, military transfers. And that's continued as a consistent call. We haven't always called it sanctions, so it's part of that BDS call. The second thing I want to say is for those of us in the United States, and I realize there's a global audience today, which is great, is the US veto at the United Nations. Half of the US vetoes have been to block criticism of the Israeli government for its violations of international law. And 1/3, this is less remembered, in the 1970s and 80s, 1/3 of US vetoes were to block international criticism of apartheid regimes in Southern Africa. So South Africa, but also what's now Zimbabwe. So it was out of that the global anti-apartheid movement turned to boycott, divestment, and sanctions. When the international community of governments were blocked, the long, proud history of churches being involved, including the United Methodists, with boycott and divestment around South Africa, and with farm workers, now with Israel. And I want to just give a couple things that we've done and say, I hope folks, if you're not already active, you'll join in and be in touch with United Methodists for Kairos Response and MFSA. It's the grassroots that always catalyzes this movement for justice, to struggle against apartheid and racism and the colonization that Sandra talked about, which I think is very important that we struggle against these things. So United Methodists for Kairos Response, MFSA, are key to that. We adopted a call for boycotting all companies involved with the settlements and the occupation. So not just settlement products, but all companies, Israeli companies, US companies, international companies. Now a call needs some teeth to it, and that's where pushing, and we've pushed Westpath, our pension fund, a lot. And in 2014, I divested from G4S because of its involvement with prisons, the Israeli prisons, but also its prison involvement elsewhere. In 2016, they came up with a human rights screen at Westpath that excluded 5 Israeli banks for their complicity with perpetuating the settlements through loans, through ATMs and branches, without the banks. And this was a key thing in the anti-apartheid struggle. Without the banking system propping up the white regime, apartheid could not last. So in the same way, without the banks propping up the settlements, the Israeli apartheid practices would not be able to sustain themselves, and without the militarism. So today, we still got a lot of work ahead of us, but I think the last thing I'll say is it's way too easy for white liberal church folks to talk about a conflict, that there's 2 sides, we need to humanize, let's jump to reconciliation. Didn't Bishop Tutu talk about reconciliation? But what apartheid does is say, no, what we're addressing is systemic identity-based discrimination to enhance the power and control of one group over against others. And we need to use the apartheid language to engage and name the injustices, and not just this false equivalence that Kelvin and Sandra have already talked about. And we need boycott, divestment, and sanctions as some of the many nonviolent actions to make the changes that we're all looking for.
Thanks, David. Just a word, other denominations have their own movements in this regard with the BDS movement and similar actions. So if you'd like to contact us, you can, and we'll let you know what your denomination might be doing. There's a good question that came up, and I'd like to have this be the last question before we get to our guest from Jewish Voice for Peace. And I'll start with Kelvin, I guess, with this, and just keep your answers short, please. What are the intersections between the struggle against white supremacy in the United States and the struggles in Palestine and South Africa? Those are huge questions, but if you can keep yourself a little brief on that, I'd appreciate it. Kelvin first. Kelvin, we're not hearing you.
There we go. The intersection, I think is very, very important, John. And that's why I talk about living at the intersection of South Los Angeles and South Africa. And the reason for that is this, what's happening, what we saw happening, on January the 6th, is just this whole sense, of people not interested in democracy, but interested in, what we call racial nationalism. Let's just say it, white, racial nationalism, and that's why I talk about apartheid as not just an ideology, but a theology. And Alan Busek was right, when he, with the International Reformed Alliance, declared apartheid as a heresy. And I think that's what we need to get at, and just really deal with that theological glacier that moves and justifies this ideological tip of the iceberg that is, in so many ways, or that fuels the drivers of discrimination and disparity.
Thank you, Kelvin. Sandra.
Yeah, it's a very important question, and one that I think can be illustrated, in the way that these conversations happen across the oppressors. I was reminded recently that Dylan Roof, the murderer that went into the church, the Black church, the AME church in Charleston, South Carolina, a few years ago, and killed 9 parishioners, wrote his manifesto on a blog site called The Last Rhodesian. Rhodesia being, in his mind, an inspiration for what he wanted for the US, an ethno-state founded on white supremacy, for whites only. Richard Spencer, the notorious white supremacist, has said that Israel is his model for what he wants in the US. And just recently, in the January 6th in the Capitol, we saw that, the rioters were carrying Israeli flags and and apartheid flags, and were carrying Indian nationalist, Hindu nationalist flags. They want this country to be for themselves alone, and they see their inspiration coming from Israel and coming from the apartheid regimes around the globe. And so we have to unite. We have to see ourselves as being part of the same struggle. If we're fighting anti-Semitism, we're fighting white supremacy. When we're fighting anti-Black racism, we're fighting white supremacy. When we're fighting against anti-Muslim hate, we're fighting white supremacy. And so that's, I hope, the lesson that we can take away, that these struggles are interlinked, and we have an analysis of how they're interlinked has to be at the root of what we do and take action.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank both of you. Sandra and Kelvin, thank you so much. And I know there are many unanswered questions. You've been submitting them. But we're at the close of that part here. I'm strongly urge you now to hang on, because there's a very important message from Jewish Voice for Peace concerning something that could happen with Facebook that will greatly impact our ability to communicate something of the struggle of Palestinians. So I'm going to invite us now to hear that. It's a little over 5 minutes, and I'm hoping that you'll stay on at least until that is over, and then we'll have some time for general chatting after that. So can we show that video?
Hi, everyone. This is Rabbi Alyssa Wise. I'm Deputy Director at Jewish Voice for Peace and co-founder of the Facebook We Need to Talk campaign. I'm really excited to be here to get to update you a little bit about where we are and our progress so far. So, as you may or may not know, or have seen on your social media feeds or in your email inboxes by now, in November, we heard that Facebook is considering adapting their hate speech policies to solidify that Zionist is a proxy for Jew in their hate speech policies, and therefore posts that are critical of Zionists should be censored, essentially, as part of their hate speech policies. And so when we heard this, we knew we had to get to work, because fundamentally, the most profound hurdle that Israel and their supporters try to put up in front of Palestinian rights activists are these claims of anti-Semitism, right? And that our concern for Palestinian freedom and our commitment to organizing for it is just, is not that, but instead is something more insincere, right? An actual demonstration of a lack of care or actually active hatred of Jews. And this is very dangerous. And in fact, when there's a target like Facebook that is in everybody's homes and everybody's lives, and that is such an important tool for Palestinians to be able to share their stories with the world, right? When the Great March in Gaza happened, social media was how people around the world were able to see it and share their solidarity with Palestinians. When there's a home demolition happening, for Palestinians to be able to share that with the world. When Palestinians want to share their culture with the world, mainstream media doesn't cover that. So social media is actually a really critical tool to reach, on Facebook in particular, 2 billion users, if not more, to share Palestinian stories, Palestinian history. And the fact is, Palestinians need to talk about the word Zionist. And what's beyond that is that this undermines our ability to dismantle anti-Semitism. When you falsely claim that Zionism is synonymous with Judaism, or Zionist is synonymous with Jew, it actually makes it harder for us to dismantle actual anti-Semitism and the ways that Jews are threatened by white supremacists, by a Christian Zionism that itself is fundamentally anti-Semitic, and how it uses Jews in order to hasten the second coming, when Jews will be killed or convert, right? There's hardly a more anti-Semitic idea than that. And this policy would undermine our ability to name that on social media. And finally, it's really critical that we need to talk about holding the Israeli government accountable. And this move by Facebook would jeopardize our ability to do that as Palestinian, myself at JVP, you all at UMKR, be able to stand in solidarity with Palestinians as they organize for their freedom and seek to hold the Israeli government accountable. And so when we got to work, we knew we needed a broad coalition to make this campaign effective, and it needed to be global. So we got to work building that. So I'm really proud to share with you that we have 55 campaign partners on this campaign. I'm just scrolling through here some of the logos. You'll see groups from around the world. You'll see organizations that we've worked with before, new organizations, particularly in the digital rights space, and core partners within the Palestinian rights movement. It's also critical that we bring this conversation into the public. So Facebook wanted to make this move. They thought they could just do it real quick with no fanfare. But part of what we're doing is making sure that this is as public a conversation as it can be, so that we can move forward this idea that how harmful it is to conflate Zionism and Judaism. So you'll see some of the pieces here in the tech world and Verge, in the Jewish world and Haaretz, more broadly, a piece that I wrote in The Guardian that outlines our concerns, and our friends at the Electronic Frontier Foundation on a more technical level, kind of addressing within the tech world the problems of this potential move by Facebook. And so we have been focused so far in the campaign on gathering signatures from people around the world. And we set ourselves a goal of getting 25,000 signatures to bring to Facebook on a global day of action. And we actually reached that goal within 4 days. And we now are over 55,000 signatures and counting. So it's really exciting to see the global support for this campaign. And about 2 weeks ago, we had the big global day of action. And I'm going to show you now a quick video to recap it. You'll get the real feel for the campaign that way.
Facebook, we need to talk.
Facebook, il faut qu'on parle.
We hate to say, Facebook, we need to talk.
We need to talk. We need to talk, and you're not letting us. +52,000 signatures. Plus de 50,000 personnes ont signé une pétition.
52,000 other people.
And this is happening all over the world. 17 cities around the world.
We're here in Denver, Colorado.
In Los Lunas, New Mexico.
Where else like Facebook has bars and stuff.
Here in Toronto, we are outside the Facebook offices here in New York.
Is this Facebook?
This is the kind of courage that we're all showing together, to be able to speak about the human rights violations at the hands of the state of Israel against the Palestinian people.
We need to talk to them as Jews.
We need to talk as Palestinians.
Sharing our experiences about daily life under military occupation
And the violence of Zionist soldiers and Zionist settlers. I stand here together with my allies and my Jewish friends to say, Facebook, don't censor us.
Such a beautiful video and spirit of the day. So if you are ready to bring this message to Facebook, you can go to facebookweneedtotalk.org/email and send an email to Facebook. It's an action tool put together by our coalition partner, Empowered Change, to email Facebook directly. So it would be great if UMKR wanted to join the campaign and in general spread the word. We need to keep the pressure on. They had said that they wanted to make their decision by the end of February. They still haven't done it. So any day now we could hear, and it just means that they're continuing the deliberation because we made it harder for them just to go ahead and do this. So we need to keep the pressure on until we hear from them that they're going to retreat from making this move. Thanks for inviting me in, and onward. Take care.
Friends, I want to let you know that UMKR, United Methodist for Kairos Response, has been a part of this campaign for a while now, and we're proud of that. There is some information in the chat about how you can sign on individually. Our next webinar will be April 14th. We don't have a specific topic yet, but we will have another webinar. We hope that you will join us. I want to thank all of those who are a part of this now and put this together. There's some behind the scenes folks, especially with Methodist Federation for Social Action. I deeply appreciate their support. And our planning team putting this together. And of course, Kelvin and Sandra, we thank you very much. We've had a time of chatting, kind of opening up the lines. And so those of you who are still with us, perhaps have a chance